Coming up on today's episode of the Salesman Podcast.
And the thing that really shocked him is when they only had one thing on their to-do list, they all did it. And so our first aha is that there's no place to hide. If you only have one thing to do, you either did it or you didn't.
Hello, Sales Nation. I'm Will Barron, host of the Salesman Podcast, and welcome to today's show. In today's show, we have Jay Papasan, co-author of The One Thing, one of the most influential books that I've ever read. This, along with Tony Robbins' Awaken the Giant Within, which is a crazy, thick, heavy book that takes me months to get through, are the two books that have had probably the most impact on my life and the business side of things as well. This is a much nicer, easier read, and it has just as much impact by narrowing your focus. And that's what we're diving into today, why salespeople need to focus on one thing rather than many to have the biggest impact. You can find out more about Jay and The One Thing over at the1thing.com. The book is available on Amazon, everywhere else as well. We link to it in the show notes over at salesman.red/190. And with that all said, let's jump into today's episode. Hi, Jay, and welcome to the Salesman Podcast.
Hey, thanks for having me.
You are more than welcome. We've talked about The One Thing all the time on the show, and so it's a pleasure to have you here. And because of that, the audience will probably know a little bit about The One Thing if they haven't already read it. But for all of those who aren't familiar, can you give us a quick elevator pitch just to set the ground rules here, perhaps, and then we can dive into it deeper and get more specific for salespeople as well?
Absolutely. I'm sure all of the people listening have heard of the 80-20 principle. And it's this idea that the minority of what we do gives us the majority of what we want. The 20% is what a lot of people call the stuff that matters. And what we wanted to do is dial that in and take the 20% of the 20% of the 20% until you just get to one number. We wanted to know what your ultimate priority was and how focusing on it will impact all the areas of our lives. So if we called the book Focus, nobody would have read it. So we gave it that nice, name, The One Thing, and people wonder what that's about. But it's really, it's about concentrating your energy so you get more out of what you do.
Okay, and now, not to color the conversation with my thoughts on this and to get yours as purely as what we can, how do you think the book is perhaps relevant to salespeople specifically?
Well, I work in the sales industry as well. I've had the good fortune of working with Gary now for 16 years. He has founded what's now the largest real estate company in the world by agent count. And 90% of my life here has been about helping salespeople succeed. And I can tell you, there's just so many balls in the air. You hear a lot of no's and you're searching for your yeses. And so I think to be able to look at all the things that we could be doing and identify the handful that we should be doing, and from that, really our number one thing, to really have clarity about where to spend our time and energy is a huge asset to the salesperson, because everybody else is running around and there's all these activities, but there's not a lot of productivity. And our book is really about helping people understand the difference.
Okay, so is there a process, is there a framework, clearly massively leading question here, to narrow down the handful of things, or even that one thing that the salespeople listening should be doing? Because most likely it is spending more time prospecting. For most people, that is probably the biggest bang for buck. Everything else flows down the funnel. So that might be the one thing that the salespeople find. But is there a process to go from all these nonsense reports that sales managers are asking for and shouting and sending you horrible in-caps emails? Then you've got the customers complaining the other end. Then you've got, deals to be closed. How do we know, or what's the framework that's in place to narrow this down and get that one thing out of it?
Well, the focusing question is at the heart of the book. It's a question that came out of Gary consulting with his top agents, his top owners, and each week they would do like a 30-minute coaching call. And I don't know if you've got a coach, but the framework is pretty simple. You identify your goals. Each week you talk about what you're doing and the results you're getting. And at the end of the call, you identify your priorities to tackle between now and the next week. And Gary would get them to label them, list them out, And in his frustration, he would notice that they just wouldn't do the most important things. They might do items 4 and 5 on the list, but they wouldn't do 1 and 2. And so he started narrowing it. He'd be like, well, if you can only do 3 things this week, what are they going to be? And then they would do 2 and 3. And finally, in true kind of parental anger, actually, he just said, look, if you can only get 1 thing done this week to move the ball forward, what's it going to be? And they can only give 1 answer. And so people usually would have their answer without hesitation. And the thing that really shocked him is when they only had 1 thing on their to-do list, they all did it. And so our first aha is that there's no place to hide. If you only have 1 thing to do, you either did it or you didn't. And the thing that surprises me continually to this day is that when people narrow it down to that thing, they tend to do all the other stuff on their list. So that's where it comes from. It's from, going back to the mid-90s was when he started consulting and the questions started to evolve. And so it's got a very specific form. So I'll read it, and I guess you can put this in your show notes so that people don't have to pull over their car and write it down. But it's, what's the one thing I can do such that by doing it, everything else is easier or unnecessary? And I'll just break that down. What's the one thing I can do? It's not 2 or 3, just like I just told you. You're going to identify the number one thing that'll lead you to your success. It's not what you could, would, or should do. It's what you can do today, right now. A lot of people talk about could do's and would do's, and they're asking the wrong question. They might be thinking about something they'll have to build towards, for a year. But what you can do today gets you that feedback loop. I always cite, and it's in the margins of the book, a poem that we read to our kids by Shel Silverstein. All the woulda, coulda, shouldas ran away from all ran away and hid from one little did. And it's this idea about getting into action. So that's the first part. Such that by doing it just means that anything you choose can't be a 1-to-1 ratio, right? The thing that you're doing can't just have one result. It's got to have something bigger. And the scale is that it's going to make everything easier or unnecessary. So we're looking for, in the 80-20 kind of language, what's the biggest lever we currently have in our arsenal that we can use today? And in our experience, when people ask it that way, what's the one thing I can do such that by doing it, everything else is easier or necessary? Almost universally, people know the answer. And most of them are looking for someone to endorse it, or they feel guilty for not doing it.
Why do we, taking a step back from this, but why do we not do the most important thing when it's in a list of 1, 2, and 3? What is the psychology perhaps behind that?
I think for one thing, none of us have a list of just 3 things, right? Our list is long, especially if you're in sales. Think about all the follow-up, all the calls, all the activities we do in order to get to the results that we want. And I think that there's all these emergencies, angry customers, you alluded to it, managers wanting TCB reports, whatever that is, right? And it feels urgent. And when I look at a long list, I'm just going to use me as an example. I think the tendency is when I'm feeling overwhelmed or I'm just wanting to make progress, I tend to do the things that I can cross out the quickest. Because what I want to do is make my list shorter. And when I make my list shorter, I feel like I've accomplished more, and I just feel better about my list. But the odd reality is our to-do list was written down in the order we thought of things, not in the order of priority. And so I think that's the number one culprit. It's either something that feels urgent, even if we know it's not the most important thing, or we're just trying to make the list shorter.
And is this a new or old phenomenon? And is this something that is going to become more and more important in the future? And where I'm going with this is that clearly we're getting beeps from all directions, salespeople especially, from internal, from customers, from external, from other stakeholders. And at some point, this is going to be a contact lens, which is electrocuting the side of your head. And it's just going to get more, assuming it's going to get more and more horrific. How has this always been a problem that needed solving, or is this a modern kind of dilemma?
I think it's a very modern one. I'm biased. I think every generation thinks they had it tougher than the last. Who knows? Maybe cavemen woke up and said, "How am I going to do all this stuff?" I don't know, but I feel like the acceleration of things through technology, our cell phones, I feel like we're always surrounded by a lot of opportunities and a lot of obligations. And in my lifetime, I was, in high school in the 80s. And, so to kind of give you a sense of where I'm coming from, I went from rotary phones to iPhones. I went from, 4 channels of TV to cable TV to Netflix. I just feel like everything is getting more diverse at a faster and faster pace. And we did a lot of research. It didn't make it into the book. There were actually like 40 pages we cut about kind of these exponential lines, like following Moore's law, about how things are getting faster and more numerous. So I can't absolutely prove it, but I suspect that we're living in a time where things are happening and opportunities are piling up around us faster than we can adapt. So I think that we lucked out a little bit. We were feeling this when we wrote the book, but it absolutely is showing up now as something that a lot of people are like, I'm struggling with this. How do I shorten this list?
Definitely. And for the salespeople now who are in have the great problem of having too many opportunities, can you just go through the question again to perhaps how a salesperson with a bunch of opportunities on the front of the desk, just to reinforce the message, how they can narrow down the opportunities to find the one that is worth diving into when they finish this podcast, when they get to work this morning after their commute, how they should suss out what they should literally be working on?
Absolutely. And if you will, I'll give you a real life example too. So the process, we call it extreme Pareto in the book. It's in, I think, chapter 3 or 4. It's very early in the book. Take your to-do list. I usually tell people, set like a timer on your watch or use egg timer on, your browser, just a free timer, and give yourself no more than 5 minutes, more likely 3. And just take your list. And then out of all the stuff that you could do today, just do it in the framework of one day, identify, like circle, star, the handful of things that are truly important. Like, this is the big stuff on my list. Most people know what that is. And then you start a new list with just those things. And then we're going to do one additional activity. You're going to use that focusing question, what's the one thing I can do? And it's in this kind of framework. If I only can do one of these things today.
And Jay, let me just jump in a second. Sorry to interrupt. But rather than things, let's talk about a salesperson has, say, 5 leads sat on their desk. So, dive into...
I can only call one of these customers, right?
Yep.
Right. So what's the one customer I can call on today such that by calling them? I mean, it's an awkward question when you put it that way, but which of these customers has the greatest sales potential? Mm-hmm. And there's a calculus there. Like, is this like elephant hunting? It might take years to convert. Like, oh, I'll call on IBM. That could take years to convert. Or it could be I'll call on the local business. That'll be a faster conversion, but a far smaller sale. I think we kind of do that calculus in our head. I'm just asking people to put a clock on it and make a quick decision. Because I think our instincts, we know where we should be pointing ourselves. And then you just list them out by number of order. Like, this is my 1, this is my 2, this is my 3. Usually you get a very small list right from that. Now, I met a guy. He had bought our book in an airport in Austin while flying to California. He worked for one of the leading biomedical companies. He was in their sales team. And he was on a team that had started the year. I don't have permission to use the company's name, but he started the year on their team. Their device group was in, I think, the top 15 in the country. Mm-hmm. But by the time the third quarter rolled around, that's when he joined the team. They were already well down the list, like in the 50s. They did this exercise. They went through their list of physicians, right? Who are the ones we were going to call on? They identified one network, one set of doctors, and the entire team only focused on them for the entire quarter. By the time they got to the fourth quarter, they were in the top 3 across the entire organization. He said once they asked the question, they all knew they're doing all of this stuff, but they knew where the biggest opportunity was. And literally, not just him, but the entire team focused on that one set of customers. And I don't know if it was a hospital or if it was just one surgical group, but that's where they went from also ran to the head of the pack. And that was so impactful. I think that organization has called me in like 9 times now to share this message. And it's really about who are the people, who are the clients, who are the core advocates for this product that won't just become a sale, they'll become a repeat sale and will tell other people about it.
I love it. And I'm glad it's almost like we prepared it, but we didn't. I promise, audience. I promise, Sales Nation, because I've got exactly the same experience of the last medical device sales role I was in. They had terrible kit. We had a program where we could exchange it on a monthly fee without going too into detail on it. It'd take up about half my target, but I knew it was a lot of work. So I essentially asked this question before I'd read the book, before I understood it. And looking further down the line, I knew that before the year ended and we were targeted year on year, they would then have to have bought loads of endoscopic camera systems to go with the scopes and everything else that went along with the initial purchase. So I knew that one thing for the year was to just get into this hospital and convert them from our biggest competitor to us. Smash target, happy days. And it was just, as you alluded to before, like I can't remember the wording you used, but ultimate kind of Pareto's law. And I think it's very easy to get wrapped up day to day in sales, just to be perhaps reactive rather than putting plans in place and asking high quality questions. And I think this is missed sometimes than that we're trained to ask high quality questions to our prospects, but we're not trained to ask them to ourselves. And where I want to go with this, Jay, before we...
That's actually, hold on, that was significant. It's funny, we use this sort of logic with the people we're in a sales cycle with, but we don't apply it to our own process. I mean, I think that's actually really a huge aha for me that you just shared. That's absolutely true. And I think that's where the question helps people look at their to-do list, their client, who they're going to call, and actually prioritize it, just like they would try to get the client to prioritize their purchases for the year.
Mm-hmm. And that's perhaps because we are trained to verbatim ask certain questions rather than understanding the linguistics and the psychology behind it, which the one thing goes through and explains why those words are used specifically. And I talk about linguistics. I can't speak today. So moving on from this, I want to wrap up the show with this before we move into the quickfire questions, Jay, because this isn't just about sales, clearly, and anyone who's read the book knows this. Give us an overview of how this one thing, the question, everything that we've talked about so far, can be shaped and pushed and leveraged in other areas of our lives as well. That even though we want to focus on sales, perhaps the other areas of our life have importance as well, of course.
Yeah, I think you're referring to my favorite page in the English edition hardcover. I think it's page 114. It's got 7 circles on it. And, we wrote this as a business book. And we wrote it with this idea that in business, especially with a sales job, you could identify the activity that would most lead to your success. And you said it already. I think in sales, 99 times out of 100, it's going to be prospecting to our customers, that habit of prospecting. Getting on the phone or face-to-face is the richest way to build relationships and build trust and actually then convert those leads. And very little replaces that with the same level of efficacy, right? So that tends to be, whenever we ask this in a sales context, the one activity. So how do you identify that and then make it a habit, right? Because we know if we've ever built a habit that it takes time. Like I've got a 10-year-old and a 12-year-old, and they are still forming the habit of brushing their teeth, right? And I have to remind them. And so the first part of our life, we do that. And today, you and I, we can get up with no coffee, very sleep deprived, and still manage to brush our teeth because that habit is ingrained. How do we take a key activity for work and do that? So to me, that was the approach for business. And what I love on page 114 is we identify, for your spiritual life, for your physical health, for your personal life, your key relationships, then your job, then your business, and then your finances, 7 areas that we believe that you could take this same approach and get very similar results.
And should we be doing these one on one, or should we be having multiple one things in different domains to, I guess, speed things up?
Okay, well, everybody listening to this is going to want to do 7 habits at the same time. We had an app for a while, and it's called The One Thing. So it's one thing at a time. And when we divide our attention, there's a lot of craziness that happens, but you become infinitely less likely to succeed. So what I tell people...
Why is that?
Success is sequential, right? So there's this idea of willpower, and it's our ability to say yes to what we need to do and no to everything else. And they've done studies on, the formation of habits It takes about 66 days on average. And when you're forming a habit, it is work, right? If you've ever done an exercise habit, getting up in the morning to run, that's a lot of energy in the beginning to form that new habit and to really build it in. And you don't want to divide it up at all. You want all of your willpower coming to bear so that you can do this thing that you've made a stand around, right? Whether it's, I'm going to make my calls every single day. Awesome. Well, once that becomes a habit, do the next thing. And you do the math, 66 days feels like a long time. I get that. But you could add 5 of these habits a year, right? You can keep doing this and have lots of habits, but just do them one at a time. Because otherwise, you're going to be doing a lot of do-overs. I've seen it, and the science suggests that it's a really, really bad thing.
Clearly, you're a successful guy, Jay. You're hanging out with people like Gary Keller. You're super successful as well. Is this habit stacking, for want of a better term?
I like that.
I may have made that up, or I may have just ripped it off someone else that I can't remember.
Okay.
I'm not sure. Before you quote it, but is this habit stacking something that you see as a trait and a trend in successful people?
Yes, and it's one of your rapid fire questions. And it's this idea, you interview people who are incredibly successful, and you're going to notice a pattern that their mornings are very purposeful. They tend to have a series, they'll call them rituals, right? My morning routine. And it might be that they journal, or they meditate, or they exercise, or they drink a green shake, right? There's things that they're getting done before most of the world is awake. And I would tell you that those represent habits that they've stacked over time. Sometimes people, I know the Miracle Morning, if you know Hal Elrod, he kind of promotes a program. I love 99.9% of stacking 6 habits all at once by calling it just one activity. It works for a lot of people too. But they're building these activities in the morning, which is when we have the most willpower and when we have the most control of our time. And you look at these people, and I've looked at artists, athletes, business giants, you name it, they all are doing this thing consciously or unconsciously, and then it starts bleeding over into the day. I think that the most successful people in any industry would tell you, by and large, they're going to have an amazing day before noon, and then the rest of the day, they're going to look very ordinary. So, it's just true. Like, they just launch their day with this amazing trajectory, and then like by 11 or 12, it's like they can be a little undisciplined, right? They're just putting out fires because they've done the most important stuff. And I'll tell you, when I launch my day that way, and I'm not perfect, nobody is, but the days that I do, I feel pretty righteous by the afternoon. I feel like I've earned a little goofing off. I'll go play Pokemon Go with the kids. I don't have to burn the midnight oil, right? I can have a little fun, but I earned it. And that's a very different feeling than most people who keep procrastinating and they feel guilty for not having done their number one.
Definitely. And with that, just to round off this part of the show before we jump into those quickfire questions, tell us a little bit about time blocking. You've alluded to it there, but I think it's worth, as you've mentioned it, in less words than that, I think it's worth just diving into it because it's something that I've implemented. And what my time block is essentially get up, I exercise, and then the one thing is that I have to have the show edited and out every single morning. And I have the same thing as what you're describing. If I don't do that, I feel super guilty. It gets to 9-10 o'clock, I feel like crap all day, and it still gets done because I guilt myself into it. But at that point, I've wasted and been miserable all day versus the other way around of, if I just get it done, I can, if at worst, I don't get any more work done and I'm not miserable and I'm happy. At best, you've opened up the day to be more reactive to everything else that's coming in on top of it.
Right, and you can get ahead of things. So time blocking is, in its simplest form, we all know how to use a calendar, right? We make appointments with other people all the time. Time blocking simply means you're making an appointment with yourself. And we want you to do that for whatever your most important work is, right? For you, it's the podcast. For me, it's writing and research time. For a programmer, it's coding time. For, like whatever that is, for whatever industry, there's that one activity. For a salesperson, it's prospecting time. So you make appointments on your calendar with yourself to do that thing. And what I love about it, we all know how to react. Like when my phone vibrates 15 minutes before the hour, I know that is cueing me to either my next meeting or my next activity, right? I know how to respond because we've all been trained already, but most people only use their calendars to make appointments with other people. And then they hope to find the time for themselves. So that's the principle. And it's funny, after the book came out, and we got it in, I think, the second printing, there was a study we found in the Journal of Health Psychology, the British Journal of Health Psychology from 2010. And they were trying to get people to exercise for 20 minutes a day. And really quickly, they had a control group, and those people were about 35% successful at 38% successful at exercising for 20 minutes a day. They had a motivation group, and these people were told that exercising 20 minutes a day would make them feel better, they'd have lower heart disease, et cetera, and they did it at about 35%. Statistically, those two groups are the same, right? They were within the margin of error, 35, 38. They had a third group. They called it an intention group. They had the same motivational material, but they had to do one additional thing. They had to make a commitment to when and where they would do their 20 minutes. They had to write down a sentence. On this day, at this time, in this place, I will exercise for 20 minutes. They were 91% likely to succeed through the simple act of navigating their calendar and identifying when and where they were going to do it. That, in essence, is time blocking. And we believe, and I think the science suggests, that it makes you 3 times more likely to do it just because it's on your calendar. And so that's time blocking. So I think that all the salespeople here, if you don't already have blocks of time that are absolutely committed to your number one thing, which is probably prospecting, it's time to look at your calendar, hopefully before noon, start doing that thing every single day. And what I love about this is that when it's on your calendar and someone says, hey, Will, can we meet tomorrow at 8 a.m.? You can say, and it's completely honest, I'm sorry, I already have another appointment at that time. How about we get together after lunch? Nobody is so narcissistic that they're going to question who you're having another meeting with. They're just going to assume that you're booked. So you can protect it really easily as well. So I think it's very simple, which is what we want for people. And people can get a lot of success through just doing this one additional thing, making appointments with themselves, time blocking.
Jay, I love it. I was trying so hard not to interrupt then because I've got 20 more questions that I could ask to dive into this, but I'm conscious of time here. So we'll jump into these quickfire questions, which will give us a bit more insight, I'm sure. First one, Kindle or paperback?
Oh, gosh, it depends on what I'm reading. All right, so I know that's not the right answer. Kindle for fiction, and it's paperback or hardcover for business. I have to write in my business books. I don't want to kill trees for my fiction. Is that fair?
That is more than fair. Okay, next one. Dollar size if possible. What's the biggest deal you've ever closed?
All right, so I thought about this. This is kind of fun. Our biggest, it's not exciting. Books don't stack up to big dollars, but we did sell 19,000 copies of The One Thing to Bank of America last year for all their small business customers. Yay! But the best deal I ever made, and this is the one that's instructive, was for a single dollar. And it was our second book deal. And I remember they were offering us this huge 6-figure advance. And we talked about what we really wanted to have happen with the book. And instead of asking for dollars, we asked for terms. And in exchange for that, we said, we just want $1. And it was the smallest advance check they'd ever cut. They actually had to send us a dollar bill in the mail because they couldn't actually do that. We have it framed downstairs. But what I love about that, and that's the first thing I thought of when I saw this question, I was like, because at the end of the day, if you're really serious about where you're going and what you're trying, the terms of any deal are almost always more valuable than the actual upfront dollar amount, because the terms will ultimately determine the true value of how much you'll get out of it. Does that make sense?
That makes total sense. And almost translating that into sales speak, I guess, it's almost equivalent of that initial deal you have with a customer isn't as valuable as perhaps that long-term business relationship that you can have with them over decades, where they're moving from company to company, you're moving from company to company or product to product, and new product services come out. And if you've got them and you've added value to them and they really appreciate you as an individual, that's clearly the terms in the agreement that is more important than that initial commission.
What's the lifetime value of that relationship versus this one deal?
Good. I like this. Okay, next one. What is one book or resource other than your own that you'd recommend to the Salesman Podcast audience?
Okay, it's funny. You said War of Art. And so I've got a stack of 5 of those I can see from my desk that I give out to people, because just like salespeople, writers also battled the resistance. So that's probably my number one. But the book I've been giving away lately, I've got 3 copies is by Salim Ismail, and it's called Exponential Organizations. And I found it to be fascinating. It's a study of these unicorn, club of companies that have all gotten billion-dollar valuations in a very short time, and they very, not scientifically, but at least studiously, have examined what are the characteristics they have in common. And it's very how-to. Like, I looked at this and I looked at our business and I thought, wow, okay, these are things that I'm going to have to adapt to. And there's a little bit of a roadmap about how we can build some exponential into whatever we're doing. So I found it very hopeful and encouraging instead of the usual, the internet's going to take your job.
Nice. And we'll link to that in the show notes over at salesman.red. And next one, who is the world's greatest salesperson?
Oh, gosh, this is the hardest question I've ever had asked. I mean, it's wonderful. That I know it's going to be Gary. I mean, I'm just going to brag on my co-author because he literally was turned away by an insurance company. That's how he got into real estate, because he doesn't have a sales profile. But what he had was a vision. And I do think that the people, and I thought about, Elon Musk. I thought about, gosh, I'm forgetting everybody's names now. I went through like the who's who. They started these big companies, and I think that fundamentally they're salespeople, because they've gotten people to buy into a vision of something that's not currently available today, but they fully plan to make real tomorrow. And to me, the people in this world who can sell at that level, to get people to buy into their vision and work for them and join them and become a movement behind them, are the kind of people that actually change the world.
Definitely. Well, you mentioned Elon Musk then. I'm sure in the higher level conversations, less kind of what he puts out to the media. His high level conversations are essentially, hey, look, we want to have solar powered cars on Mars.
Yeah.
And then that's it. We pause for a few seconds while it sinks into everyone. Well, it'll start with Tesla. We'll start with Solar City or whatever his solar power company's called, and work up from there. But selling a vision, selling something that's intangible it's still, as a pretty good B2B salesperson, is crazy to me. So I appreciate that, Jay.
I sat down with somebody and he told me what they were selling, and I just remember I said, oh, it sounds like what you're providing for people is you are speeding new employees through the learning curve of a job. And just sometimes looking at, like, let's just put this in the salesperson's context. Don't tell people that we've got a suite of tools that will educate your new employees, whatever. What you're doing is you're speeding up the learning curve. Because that's human language. That's a vision that people can buy into, because that's what I want. And you know this. I mean, you've sold. I don't sell like that. But I do think that a lot of people get caught up in the technicalities of what they're doing and not the vision for what they're actually creating for the customer. And that the customer wants their problem solved. And if we can show them how we're doing that, that's where that vision shows up in the ordinary salesperson's world.
Definitely. And just to follow up on that, because I think this is important, and then we'll wrap up the show with one more question. It's how you describe that is super interesting to me, because this also then goes that level deeper of, if you're dealing with a CEO, he probably doesn't even care about that. He just cares that you're going to save X amount of dollars, or X amount of dollars, X amount of time.
Reduce turnover, right?
Yeah. Versus if you're dealing with, if it's a software product that achieves those goals, if you're dealing with the technician on the ground, they probably do want to hear that it's a tech product that fits in with this stack and does this and this. So the messages have to be infinitely changeable. And that's what I love about sales, perhaps versus marketing, in that you should be having a one-on-one communication that is so deep and innate, and you have to be so present in it that no marketing message can compete when you're sat opposite someone in a room and you're going at it like that. And I just thought that was worth going over and emphasizing a little bit further.
And it demands a lot of the salesperson, because they have to have real command of what their selling can do for all of those different kinds of customers. So that's awesome. I love that.
Good stuff. And final one, because I'm conscious of time here, Jay. If you could go back in time and speak to your younger self, what would be the one piece of advice you'd give him to help him become better at selling?
I think no one succeeds alone is the best advice I've been given. And it's, again, coming from my partner, who was the unlikely salesperson, who's not the right fit for CEO, and he succeeded in all of these fields. And he just looked up and understands that I think everybody has their gifts and we need to embrace them. Everyone has their one thing, if we can indulge that language one more time. And that at the end of the day, if something big is missing from your life, there's probably a big relationship missing. And the farther I've gone on my career and with the businesses that we've built, I just see it all around me now. I see missing relationships, and they require you to be willing to let your world expand to make room for those relationships. But that's how you can really make a big impact in your industry, in your company, and maybe even in bigger realms, is by surrounding yourself with the absolute best people. So that to me would be, hey, I wish I'd learned that like a decade earlier, because I was so focused on my own performance. I maybe wasn't as focused enough about surrounding myself with even better performers.
And is that something you just missed? Because it's something I work on as well. Or is this down to ego? Is this down to confidence in yourself? Or is this down to the ability to be vulnerable? Is there something more to that?
Well, I hope it's not about ego. I mean, I think that I know me personally, I tend to be very inwardly competitive. I really want to do my best. Very early on, some formative experiences, I don't like to quit. And so I tend to put my head down and do my part, right? And I want to do it at a very high level. And sometimes when you put your head down and get to work, right, I'm just going to dive right in. You're not looking around and seeing who's around you. I honestly think I missed it. I think the moment I saw it, I knew it was true, which meant I'd already learned it, but I wasn't acknowledging it or incorporating it in my life. And it just, you had to just stop for a second and say, okay, so I know this is true. I get this. Why am I not behaving this way more often? I wish I had all of those answers, but it's something I try to lead with now. You know, my friend Jeff, he's been on your show. When I wanted to launch a new online training company, I knew that I could do that, but that would have been moving me away from my highest, greatest use. So I had to wait, and I did not like to wait. I'm not a patient person, but I waited like 9-10 months until I found him and recruited him to move from San Diego to Austin to launch that product. Because I knew, like great, it only took me 47 years. I finally learned it, and my life is a lot simpler because I made that decision instead of just trying to do it myself.
Sure. And I wasn't saying, and I wasn't calling you out for having a huge ego there, Jay.
No, I had to think about it. I'm like, okay, is that, is it me getting in my own way? That's a great question. It's a true one.
And the reason I asked is because I get in my own way of it as well. Because there's a number of occasions where I'll be, I could do a show with a guest host, or I could do this. And I'm like, well, no. Or I could be like, well, this person wants to promote the show, or these people, they want us to pay for the promotion or whatever it is. And in my head, I go, no, sod it. I can do it better than them. I can do it bigger than them. I can do it faster than them. If I just put in more time, I can do this way and this way. And then this kind of alludes to your story, then your anecdote of, as soon as you start doing that, you move away from the one thing, and then everything else grinds to the halt. The most important thing grinds to a halt, and then you're running around putting out fires when perhaps outsourcing something, employing something, having a teammate, and especially for the salespeople listening, going to your sales manager and saying, "Hey, can you help me with this?" Because most of them are dying to be out, not in front of a computer, out in the field or speaking with customers, because most of them have obviously been promoted from salespeople, and that's what they love at their core. So with that, Jay,
can we just stay on that one more second? Only because I'm like salespeople in particular. Like I work with 140,000 of them in my company. There's also this shiny object thing. Like they're bored with success, so they want to do something different, right? So instead of bringing someone else to do it, they just want more variety. I think that's very characteristic in our industry. And then I learned this from Rory Vaden. I don't know, do you know Rory Vaden?
No.
He wrote a book called Procrastinate on Purpose. That's something that you should definitely explore, and I'll hook you up. But he taught me this thing called the 30X rule. I also think a lot of salespeople, the ones who are really good, are innately impatient. And he learned this from a guy on a plane. Rory told me that there's this thing called the 30X rule. And if it takes you 10 minutes to do it, to train someone to do it as well as you will take 30 times that amount of time. And so you start doing the math, and you're like, what? You really want me to spend, what is that, like 4.5 hours on something that only takes me 10 minutes a day? But then you look up and you realize that over the course of a year, if you just invested that 4 or 5 hours, you would have gotten back days of your time. And it's that short-term thinking that I think, the impatience, we're going to get it done because we will get it done fast and pretty well. The time it takes to slow down, to speed up, is something that a lot of us miss. So the number one thing a lot of salespeople just need to get faster is someone like on the admin side to start handing all of that stuff off.
Definitely. It's clearly not, there's the cliche of you should be spending your time selling. And my experience has been that exactly how you just described, which is fantastic, I just go, well, I'll just send the email. I'll just do this. I'll just do this report. I'll just follow up.
It'll take me longer to explain it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
When I've been put in a position where I've had a junior salesperson following me around, and I've had people that I could have trained in admin support that I never did. And yeah, that sums it up perfectly. So thank you for that, Jay. And we've covered quite a lot of the ground with the one thing. Tell us where we can find out more about it, and then where we can find out more about you as well.
Sure. If they just visit theonething.com, and that's the1thing.com, we've got our book there. We have a class on time blocking called Time Blocking Mastery, all kinds of resources. And if you look on the author page, I think there's links to all my social accounts as well. And I actually man those at certain times of the day. So if someone wants to reach out, they can find me all through that one place, theonething.com.
Amazing. We will link to that in the show notes over at salesman.red. And with that, Jay, I want to thank you for, 1, the book, 2, coming on the show and obviously giving you his time, and then 3, for opening up and giving us some really good insights today. I appreciate that. And with that, Jay, I want to thank you for joining us on the Salesman Podcast. Thank you so much for having me. It's been real fun. And there we have it. Thank you, Jay, for your time. I appreciate it coming on the show. It's absolutely fascinating to talk with you. And Jay, I'll say it, he put in a good 45 minutes after the call as well to go through a couple of the things that I'm working on business-wise to give me some feedback and advice. So I appreciate that, Jay. Not everyone would do that. Not everyone does do that. And so, that separates yourself from other guests that come on the show for sure. And with that, I clearly highly recommend this book. It's available on Amazon. You can find out more about it in the show notes over at salesman.red/190. And with that, Sales Nation, I'll speak with you all again tomorrow.